So the Earth is not enough for the post-Kantians. Um, we get into many-sided, which was an epithet of Odysseus, um, confusion, um, not merely between the Scylla and the Charybdis, or between smashing up on the rocks or being eaten by some kind of savage beast. In the post-Kantian situation, precisely because the Earth or existence isn't enough for Kant. Kant, in a way, exposes the Earth. So by Earth, I mean um, this which we, generally speaking, call reality. In other words, we're awake, it's external. And this which quite a few people take for granted and then make leaps to much more complex beliefs. So, for instance, if you take for granted the pistis, as Plato calls it, the reliability, the reliance of our senses, of the eyes, that there stand before us congeries of various leaves in the shadow of some concrete, that those things can be taken to be real, and that we can be, as it were, in this Suhanden mode with them. We can operate without even thinking, as though we had mastery of such things which we do as walking. But of course, it's very surprising to learn the number of things small children must indeed learn, such as how to walk. So we have habits, and those habits conduce towards reliability. And this seems to already have been thought by Plato, but the way out of it for Plato was to go upwards, as it were, to reasoning, to speaking in a way that is reasonable and makes sense. And through the different levels of Socratic thought. But the problem we're faced with after Kant and after Locke and after these considerations have been highlighted is these problems that we were thinking about with Nietzsche, that the things before us could merely be how it appears to a human being, but something at a different level of evolution would see it differently. A spider would have different eyes. When we don't consider that, we jump to the conclusion such as that this Catholic theory of the Big Bang, it was some Catholic mathematician came up with that, but you don't have to go with the Big Bang theory, but that there was something, a heat event, 14 billion years ago or so, is then the proof that the world existed without human beings. And so this thinking is just like what George Berkeley says when he says the horse is in the stable. So the horse is in the stable, we don't have to be looking at it. The Mercedes-Benz is in the garage, even if there's no camera there, even if nobody sees it, it's still there. And these people just say, what happened 14 billion years ago, it was there, and it would be like that. It doesn't matter if somebody's witnessing it or not. So that's a different level of we see that's just a distinction. That's not even a different level. But the different level would be whatever we're seeing right now, whether the whole world seems to us colored or it seems to us black and white, or whether it's through the eyes of a spider or whatnot. This is where we tear into the earth, and there's this extra complexity that we get to this question of the transcendental. So, for instance, Slavoj Žižek says he determined early on that Heidegger was merely a kind of quote-unquote super transcendentalist or super transcendental. So what's a transcendental means that Kant says to himself, however it is that we're, let's say virtual reality, however virtual reality is appearing to us, in other words, that which this eye shows, remembering that we're not, as is often suggested by the popular media, as it were, meaning the scientists themselves, that we are our neurons. This is doesn't make sense, because that way pictures us as a little Smurf kind of looking through some squiggly um, binoculars, and the binoculars end in our eyes, and the in between is the optic loop or something. Like, we're not inside our we're not standing like behind our neurons looking out through the eyes or something. That doesn't make any sense. So it's like the whole thing has to be taken this way, the Kantian way. The whole thing has to be created ex nihilo, and poof, here it is. But the question is, what relationship does it have to ultimate reality? The suggestion that there's the view from the spider's point of view, the view from our point of view, the view from our neighbor's point of view, et cetera, the view from an eye with four cones or three cones. This suggests that there's one reality which is producing as a manifold all these different images of it, like a funhouse mirror or so forth. So then we have this question in Kant, is brought to consciousness of the difference between that reality and the funhouse mirror in that sense, which wasn't problematic for the tradition. But Kant himself basically solves this by assuming one. He basically assumes that because he's prior to the theory of evolution, he assumes that basically, even though there's all kinds of different animals, that the human beings are the supreme moment, and that on all the other, I guess what is particularly a proof of this is that he assumes that on all the other planets, because recently in Kant's time it's become topical, this notion that aside from the fixed stars that are visible, there's other stars that are invisible, outside our reach of vision, and so there must be these endless remote regions, right? So then Kant's speculating, what about the beings on the other planets? But he absolutely presupposes that they would be human beings, and he thinks only what would their level of moral development be? Probably a reflection like this leads him to say that, given the Socratic premise that anything thought, even thought, if it becomes a habit, it's ruinous to our whole being. So from something, start from that, maybe even prior to becoming habit, but even having a thought that's contrary to morality, let's say, starting from that, he must come to the view that there must be no lying under any circumstances. The promise can't be broken. Even saying that there can't be lies because the promise can't be broken is questionable, whether that's a means to an end. But I don't think it actually is. It just demonstrates what the lie would be all about. In other words, our fellow citizens must be able to trust our verbal utterances. And when you think about the innumerable remote stars, that there would be other human beings at different levels of moral development on all those stars, then Kant's notion becomes, in a way, a fait accompli, because then he thinks, aren't some of these planets in a perfect state of moral development? And wouldn't that entail this thought that, which is like what Hegel says, the rational is the real, but it's achieved in a different way, that whatever ought to be Solon, whatever ought to be, can be, because he assumes amidst this, there must be other planets at a higher stage of development, and there's probably some that are perfected, to reiterate. So it kind of follows that he would come to these ultimate states and think that there was something realistic in that, which is, however abstruse it might seem that Kant's thoughts are, it trickles into the stream of ordinary thought, in the sense that we are always totally, or maybe it's the reverse, maybe Kant got it from historical development, we don't know. But the sense that there is development, the sense that there's, for instance, there were never lawyers in Western history that were women, and now more than 50% of the law school graduates are women. So things like that make people think that great changes can happen and great changes for the better can happen, and there's many such cases. So Kant just takes it to the furthest development, and he's aided by these kind of thoughts he has about the other planets and so on. If you think of Kant's, one of his most famous statements from um, the Critique of Practical Reason, where he's saying, immer neuer, always newer, are is my admiration and awe for these two things. And he says this admiration is happening um, not in the heart, but he uses a funny. I don't. My German isn't good enough to know, but I think maybe it's just an old-fashioned phrase, but maybe he uses it deliberately. He speaks not of Hertz, Herzen, not of the heart in the ordinary German word for heart, but he uses this word Gemüt or Gemüde with it's like the word Gemütlichkeit. He uses this funny form of the word heart that's very unusual, but maybe it was because he was writing a long time ago. But and he goes on to say this ever newer. So this is already reminding me of the Anfang. This ever newer, immer neuer awe and admiration for the two things, for the starry sky above and for the moral law within. And also he uses a funny word here also for starry. He says it's something like, I think it would usually be sterner, like sterner Himmel, but he doesn't say that. Maybe it's hard to tell. I don't know if it's old-fashioned language or it's just for some other reason, or if it's his deliberate prose style. But in comparing this to Heidegger, I want to think about the language being used closely. So he says, der gesternte Himmel über mir, the starry sky over me. Here, this starry sky over him would be taken to mean physics. It's the subject matter of Newton and the subject matter of the phenomena in Kant's sense, the phenomenological, the realm which here Nietzsche is saying is the first step in our metaphors, because it just happens that we virtual reality or we produce things in that phenomenal state. But for Kant, in the state that it now looks to us here, so to somebody else, to a spider, whatever, it would look different, right? So it just happens. According to Nietzsche, that appears more goalless, random, and so forth. All the things that he commonly gets on about. So, but for Kant, it appeared that this was simply, there was only one question here. There's the question, how does any being at all get access to experience? And then there's one answer, being in, not being, but of course Kant rules out being, but space and time. That even if we close our eyes, we can reasonably, and we're traveling in a wagon or so, we fall asleep, we can reasonably assume that we'd crossed a certain span of space, Kant says. Or I suppose a carriage, lulling in our carriage. And that, I think Kant may admit that abstraction from time in some sense is possible. But he basically says this is the structure that any thinking being, any member of the thinking part of the community must have in order to have any experience whatsoever. So, and this he's already raising questions that are sort of alien to the tradition and making things more many-faceted in a way that makes our thinking through it very difficult. Um, so you open up not just sort of two sides of substance, like what physics deals with, which can be enumerated, and then what a thing is for reason, which has to be spoken about. Um, these two fields, I suppose, in their most unqualified, in their form, which has no qualification upon it, um, appear before Heidegger as, on the one side, history, and on the other side, physics. So, but notice that um, you fall into an abyss on the side of the physics with the fact that the data of the senses are so multiplicitous. Um, the squirrel sees things through one kind of eye, the octopus through another. Who knows, even the plant may have some sense data of some kind, even if it has no sort of CPU or brain, properly speaking, to relay the data. We don't know that that's, if you think of the problem of consciousness, we can't really even assume that of a plant. So there's many more problems in Kant. But I think it's interesting to go back to this phrase in connection to Heidegger. So the phrase that appeared on Kant's tombstone, as we were saying on the Critique of Pure Reason. So the word Gemüt, I think, is whether it's, I don't know if it's Gemüta or Gemüd, which is part of the word Gemütlichkeit, is related to the English word. There's this close relationship between the, I guess, the language of the Juts, or however they're called, Jutes, Anglo-Saxons, and the German language. It's people that came over from Denmark, I suppose. This word Mut, M-umlaut-U-T, is related to the English word mood. So this meaning of the word heart, Gemüt, taken to mean heart, which is an unusual word for heart in German, so far as I know. But my understanding of German is not up to scratch at all, and I don't know these things, so I could be wrong. But if we interpret it that way, it yields something in the final degree, I think, anyway, which is that it's in this mood that Kant is saying immer neuer, always newer, awe and regard is building up. So ever newer. He's thinking of the basic things in a way where he's ever renewing his sense of them, and this is happening in his mood or in his heart. And these things are, again, they're the starry sky above and the moral law within. So the moral law within seems to link to the subject of science in the Greek sense, meaning of the ideas, just of the ideas, let's say. Anything we encounter is an idea, but they focus, a stone, hair, chalk, etc., metal, a statue, etc. But they usually focus on the higher ideas, right? Plato is all focused on the higher ideas, the good, the true, the beautiful, courage, etc. So the moral law within requires the logos to basically do something which arguably he was already doing in Socrates. Kant himself points directly more to Aristotle and Aristotle's language, which is a more fixed form. But if you think of, I think I'm running out of time, but I wanted to go into basic Socratic method, so we can see how the logos is supposedly this mendacious moment where we're inventing knowledge with the logos by going into the generalizations, for instance, generalizations as ideas, the concept and analysis of concepts leading to definitions, which then end up being, in Socrates' words, the identity of virtue and knowledge, because when we're able to construct the definitions ourselves from our own resources, that means we really see what we're doing, and therefore seeing it, we know it, and we'll go on with that. This kind of thinking is still reaching Kant in this sense. So, all right. So far we're a little bit. I'm sorry, this is sort of inchoate to some extent, but I'm trying to bring this tie this knot here up with the next recording.